Especially for you, my dear. My mother-in-law, Margaret, beamed as she placed the steaming mug in front of me. Her voice was sweet, almost too sweet, like honey masking something bitter. I smiled, though my stomach clenched. So sweet, I said, keeping my tone light. I wrapped my hands around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into my palms. But there was something off. The aroma rising from the cup wasn't the rich, comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee. It carried a strange, almost chemical-like tang, something metallic that tingled in the back of my throat before I even took a sip. Across the table, my husband Steve barely looked up from his phone, one arm draped over the back of his chair, his usual air of arrogance suffocating the space between us. "Drink up," Margaret chirped, her eyes twinkling. "I made it just the way you like it." She had never cared how I liked my coffee. For 7 years, I had sat at this table, enduring her constant condescension, her not-so-subtle digs, and her smothering influence over Steve. She had always been the quiet puppeteer, pulling the strings of my marriage, reinforcing my husband's belief that he was above me, that I was lucky to be with him, that he was doing me a favor. And Steve? He fed off her approval, a golden boy who could do no wrong in her eyes, while I was the outsider who could never measure up. My fingers tightened around the handle. I glanced at Steve. He didn't even notice the way his mother's eyes flicked toward my cup, the slight tension in her jaw as she waited. Why is she watching so closely? Then I remembered. This wasn't the first time something seemed off about what she had given me. 2 months ago, after a family dinner, I had spent the entire night curled in pain on the bathroom floor, my stomach cramping violently. Margaret had played the concerned mother-in-law role flawlessly. "Maybe you have a sensitive stomach, dear. Perhaps you should watch what you eat." And Steve? He had just rolled his eyes, blaming me for ruining the evening with my drama. Another time, it was an odd dizziness after tea at her house, my head swimming, my body feeling sluggish and uncooperative. Margaret had patted my hand. "Oh dear, maybe you're just dehydrated." And Steve had laughed, teasing me about not being able to handle a simple cup of tea. But now? Now she was watching too closely, waiting too intently. I felt my heartbeat quicken as my mind raced. "What is in this coffee?" Margaret's lips twitched, her expression carefully neutral. "She wants me to drink it. She expects me to drink it." A quiet, slow breath. Then, without hesitation, I shifted my mug closer to Steve's seat. I leaned forward, feigning interest in my phone, my fingers carefully wrapping around the handle of his coffee cup instead. Then, with a quick, deliberate movement, I switched the mugs. The ceramic barely made a sound against the tablecloth, my actions smooth, practiced, because I had learned to survive in this house by being careful. Steve didn't notice. He was still scrolling through his phone, his usual indifference on full display. I picked up the cup meant for him and took a slow sip. Black, no sugar. Just the way he always drank it. And Steve? He finally lifted his cup, the one Margaret had placed so carefully in front of me, and took a sip without a second thought. Margaret's smile faltered, just for a second, just a flicker of something in her eyes. Panic, fear, shock, before she schooled her expression back into a pleasant, motherly mask. Steve, oblivious as ever, set the mug down, his fate sealed in a single, casual sip. And I watched. I waited. Steve sighed loudly, rubbing his temple as he scrolled through his phone, his usual arrogance still intact. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each second since he had taken his first sip of coffee. Margaret's eyes darted toward him every few moments, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the tablecloth. She wasn't watching me anymore. Her attention had shifted entirely to her son. I sat back, feigning ignorance, forcing a casual smile as I took another slow sip from Steve's cup. He exhaled sharply, his brow furrowing. "Something wrong, sweetheart?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He blinked a few times, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know. I just feel a little off." I took another sip of coffee, my pulse steady, my hands resting easily on the table. Maybe you should drink some water. Margaret's nails dug into the tablecloth. I... Steve started, but his sentence broke off abruptly. He swallowed hard, shifting in his chair. Then, his face twisted slightly, his jaw clenching as though suppressing a sudden wave of nausea. The room grew unnervingly quiet. Margaret pushed her chair back suddenly, the legs scraping against the polished floor. "Steve, maybe you should lie down," she said quickly, too quickly, as though she already knew exactly what was happening. My chest tightened, but I kept my face neutral. He groaned softly, shaking his head. "No, His breathing grew heavier, beads of sweat forming along his hairline. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, his fingers unsteady. I stared at him, the realization settling deep in my bones. She knew. She knew something was in that coffee. Margaret stood up abruptly, moving toward him as though she could physically pull him away from the situation she had created. "I'll get you something, honey," she said. "Maybe a cold cloth." She was panicking, not over concern for her son, but because she was losing control of the situation. Steve clenched his jaw, waving her off. "I just need a minute," he muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. I leaned forward, watching Margaret carefully. "I don't understand," I said, feigning innocence. "Steve, you just drank the same coffee your mother made for me. If I'm fine, why aren't you?" Margaret froze. The blood drained from her face. Steve, still sluggish, didn't immediately react to my words. But Margaret! Her breathing changed. I don't know," she stammered. "Maybe he's coming down with something." "Coming down with something?" I stared at her, my mind piecing everything together in a way that suddenly made my stomach turn. How many times had I been coming down with something over the last few years? How many times had I spent nights curled in pain, feeling like my body was betraying me, while Steve and Margaret looked on without an ounce of concern? But now it was him. Steve wiped his face, his movement slower, his skin paler. He muttered something under his breath and stood up too fast. The moment he pushed himself away from the table, his body swayed unsteadily. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stumbled forward, grabbing onto the edge of the counter for balance. "Whoa," he muttered. "What the hell is going on?" Margaret was already moving, already trying to regain control. "Sweetheart, just sit down, I'll—" "No," I interrupted, my voice firm. "Let's call a doctor." Both of them froze. Steve shook his head, blinking rapidly. "It's nothing, I just need a second." He doesn't even realize how bad it is yet. Margaret's breathing had turned shallow. I could see the fear in her eyes now, full and undeniable. She didn't just look worried. She looked caught. And that's when I knew. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a bad batch of coffee or a coincidence. Margaret had done something to that drink, and Steve? He was just now feeling what I had felt over and over again. The betrayal, the confusion, the sickness creeping through his body, slow at first, then undeniable. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced my expression to remain calm. I pushed my chair back and stood up. "I'll call an ambulance," I said. Steve waved me off again, but I saw it. The slight panic in his eyes, the way he wasn't in control anymore. Margaret shot forward, gripping his arm. No, there's no need for that." I turned my gaze to her, and that's when I smiled. "Why not?" I asked softly. She flinched. She opened her mouth to respond, but I saw it in her eyes. She didn't have an answer. Because Margaret had spent years making me feel helpless, like I was imagining things, like I was weak. But I wasn't the weak one now. I folded my arms, tilting my head slightly. "Unless, of course," I said slowly, watching her expression darken. "There's a reason you don't want a doctor to examine him." The room fell silent. Margaret stared at me, and for the first time in all the years I had known her, she looked afraid of me. Margaret's fear was palpable, her fingers twitching at her sides as she tried to maintain control over the situation. But it was slipping through her grasp. Fast. Steve was getting worse by the second. His normally upright posture had weakened, his shoulders slumping forward, and his breathing was labored. He gritted his teeth, gripping the counter as if he were holding on to the last bit of stability he had left. But still, he refused to believe it. "I don't need a doctor," he muttered, his voice tight. Just give me a minute." I raised an eyebrow, folding my arms across my chest. "Steve, you can barely stand. I'm calling an ambulance." I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers hovering over the screen. Margaret lunged. She reached across the table, gripping my wrist with surprising force. "There's no need," she said quickly, her voice a touch too desperate now. I didn't react immediately. Instead, I studied her. Really studied her. Her breathing was uneven, her pupils were dilated. She was shaking, not from worry, but from pure, unfiltered panic. I met her gaze and spoke slowly. "What did you put in his coffee, Margaret?" The color drained from her face. Steve's head snapped up, his glassy eyes locking onto his mother. She hesitated. That hesitation alone was enough. Steve exhaled sharply, finally registering what I had been suggesting all along. His own mother had done something to him. Margaret shook her head, her mouth opening and closing, trying to come up with a way to twist the situation, to manipulate, to lie her way out. But it was too late. I wasn't the naive, obedient daughter-in-law anymore. I yanked my wrist from her grasp and hit call on my phone. Margaret's panic turned to rage. Her hands slammed onto the table as she leaned forward. "Olivia, stop this! You're making a scene over nothing!" My lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "Funny, isn't it?" I said. "That's exactly what Steve used to say to me when I was the one feeling sick." Steve stiffened. The words hit him like a slap, like something he had never truly considered before. Margaret's head jerked toward him, her mouth twisting into something almost desperate. "Sweetheart," she soothed, "she's overreacting. You're just exhausted. Let's get you to bed." Steve flinched away from her. For the first time, his mother's touch repulsed him. He didn't trust her anymore. I don't." His voice faltered, his body still fighting against whatever she had given him. But he knew. He knew. The realization settled over him like a thick fog, the weight of it pressing down, suffocating him. I stepped closer, my voice soft but firm. "You don't feel right, do you?" Steve shook his head, his arrogance gone. His breathing had become shallower, his hands unsteady. The phone rang in my hand. Margaret's entire body went rigid. A voice crackled through the speaker. 911. What's your emergency?" Before Margaret could jerk forward and try to stop me again, I turned my back on her, stepping away. "I need an ambulance," I said, loud and clear, making sure every single word was heard. Steve sagged against the counter, his weight shifting unsteadily. He was fighting to stay upright now. Margaret's world was crashing down around her. I could hear her sharp, frantic breathing behind me, but I didn't turn around. I was done being afraid of her. "This is Olivia Bennett," I continued. "My husband drank something at his mother's house, and now he's having trouble breathing, feels weak, and is sweating excessively. I believe—" I paused, letting my words sink in. "I believe he was poisoned." There it was. The truth. Raw, exposed, irrefutable. Margaret collapsed into her chair, a breathless gasp escaping her lips. She wasn't in control anymore. A long silence filled the room. Then Steve, still unsteady, his voice hoarse, finally spoke. "Mom!" His voice shook, with betrayal, with confusion, with disbelief. "What the hell did you do to me?" Margaret didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. The sirens started wailing in the distance, and I smiled, because for the first time in years, Margaret was finally powerless. The wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the thick tension in the room. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, her hands clenched into fists on the table. Her once perfectly composed demeanor had crumbled, replaced with something raw and desperate. Steve, pale and sweating through his shirt, sat slumped against the counter. His breath was coming in short, uneven gasps now, his body clearly struggling against whatever was in his system. I stood between them, my phone still in my hand, my heart pounding steadily in my chest. It was happening. Years of humiliation, manipulation, gaslighting, years of being told I was weak, that I was imagining things, that I was being dramatic. And now, reality was hitting Steve like a freight train. The man who had spent years belittling me, dismissing my pain, siding with his mother against me, was now looking at her with something close to horror. The first flicker of doubt, the first time he was forced to see her for what she truly was. And that realization terrified him. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the window as the ambulance skidded to a stop outside. Margaret's head snapped up. "No," she whispered. I turned toward her, calm, steady, ready. "This is happening," I said simply. She shook her head, her eyes darting between me and her son, as if she could still somehow fix this, as if she could still control it. She stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. "Listen to me, Olivia," she hissed, her voice sharp with desperation. "If you don't say anything, if you tell them it was just a misunderstanding, then..." "Then what?" I cut her off, my voice even. "Then you'll get to keep doing this? Keep getting away with it?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. She didn't have an answer, because she knew, deep down she knew. This wasn't the first time. And Steve? He knew it now, too. I turned back to him, watching the way his face contorted with realization. I didn't have to spell it out for him. All the times I had been sick, all the times he had laughed it off, all the times his mother had played innocent while I suffered. He knew, and that knowledge was crushing him. The paramedics burst through the front door, two of them rushing toward Steve. Margaret staggered back, pressing herself against the wall, as if she could disappear into it. "What's his condition?" One of the paramedics asked me, his voice urgent. "He's dizzy, sweating, disoriented," I said. "It started about an hour ago, right after he drank his coffee." One of them immediately began checking Steve's vitals, while the other prepped a stretcher. "What's in the coffee?" the second paramedic asked, already assessing the situation. My eyes locked onto Margaret. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Slowly, I turned back to the paramedic. "I don't know," I said, my voice deliberately loud. "But his mother made it, specifically for me." That was it. That was all I had to say. Because the second those words left my mouth, Margaret's entire body went rigid. One of the paramedics turned toward her. "Ma'am, is that true?" She didn't answer. I watched as she struggled to find a way out, to lie, to twist the truth, to manipulate, but there was no way out. Not this time. Steve, his voice hoarse, his body weak, finally spoke. His next words would change everything. "Mom!" He swallowed hard. "What did you do to me?" Margaret flinched, as if he had slapped her. The paramedics were already lifting Steve onto the stretcher. One of them turned to me. "He needs to be transported immediately. Are you riding with him?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." Margaret stepped forward, a last desperate attempt to grasp some sliver of control. "Wait." I turned to her, my expression unreadable. "You should probably get a lawyer," I said. Then I walked out the door, leaving her standing there, helpless. The hospital smelled sterile, a mix of antiseptic and something metallic that clung to the air. The beeping of machines filled the space around us, each sound a reminder of how close Steve had come to something irreversible. I sat in the corner of the emergency room, watching as the doctors worked around him, checking his vitals, running tests, asking questions. Steve lay still, his skin pale, his body weak from whatever had been in that coffee. But his eyes were open now, and for the first time in years, they were looking at me, really looking at me. Not with indifference, not with arrogance, but with something else entirely, something that looked a lot like guilt. A doctor approached, his expression unreadable as he flipped through a chart. "Mr. Bennett, your test results show elevated levels of a toxic compound often found in prescription sedatives. We're lucky you didn't ingest more. Steve swallowed hard. The doctor turned to me. You mentioned his mother made the coffee? I nodded. Yes. She made it for me, but Steve drank it instead. The doctor's expression darkened. We'll need to report this to the authorities. Cases like this don't just get ignored. Steve closed his eyes. His fingers clenched into fists against the hospital sheets. He knew the consequences were coming. The doctor gave me a small nod before walking away, leaving the two of us in thick, suffocating silence. And then, finally, Steve spoke. I didn't know. I let out a breath, leaning back against the chair. Didn't you? His jaw tensed. I didn't expect him to admit it. I didn't expect him to apologize. Steve wasn't the kind of man who apologized, but for the first time, he couldn't meet my eyes. The silence between us stretched long, heavy, years in the making. How long? I asked quietly. His head turned slightly, brow furrowing. What? I kept my voice calm, measured, unshaken. How long have you known that something wasn't right? That things weren't normal? Steve hesitated, and then his face broke. Just a flicker of something. Recognition. Regret. I knew that look, because deep down he had always known. Maybe not in clear, undeniable terms. Maybe not in something he would say out loud. But he had seen the patterns. He had noticed the way I was always the one getting sick. He had watched me suffer and convinced himself it was a coincidence. Because to admit otherwise? To admit that his own mother was capable of this? That would mean accepting that he had failed to protect me. And Steve never liked admitting when he was wrong. His lips parted, then closed again, as if he wanted to say something, needed to say something. But what could he say? That he was sorry? That he wished he had listened? That he regretted choosing his mother's comfort over my safety? None of it mattered now. I sighed, looking toward the window, the city lights blinking in the distance. You always took her side. Steve flinched, just slightly. You thought I was overreacting, that I was dramatic, that I made things up for attention. I shook my head. You never believed me. His breathing was uneven now. Olivia! No. My voice was firm, steady. You don't get to say my name like that anymore. His face twisted, but he didn't argue. Because he knew I was right. The door opened, and a nurse stepped inside. Mr. Bennett, a detective is here to speak with you. Steve stiffened. This was it. The unraveling of everything he had ignored. Everything he had chosen to overlook. And this time, there was no escaping the truth. The door to Steve's hospital room swung open, and in walked Detective Harper, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. She carried a notebook in one hand, a voice recorder in the other, and the weight of inevitable consequences on her shoulders. Steve barely lifted his head. He looked defeated, his body weakened by whatever Margaret had put in his coffee. The coffee meant for me. I stayed seated in the corner, my arms crossed, my heartbeat steady. Mr. Bennett, Detective Harper greeted, her tone clipped, professional. I understand you suffered a reaction to something in your drink. Steve swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked at me first. Not at the detective, not at the wall, but at me, like he was waiting for permission, like he still thought I was the one who would protect him. I held his gaze, unflinching. For years, he had watched his mother slowly destroy me and had done nothing. And now he was in my position, except I wasn't going to save him. I raised an eyebrow, waiting. Steve turned back to the detective, his jaw tightening. Yeah, he muttered. Something was off about the coffee. The detective nodded, flipping open her notebook. Your wife informed us that your mother prepared the coffee specifically for her, that you drank it by mistake. Is that correct? Silence. A long, painful silence. Steve was caught between the truth and the lie. The truth meant betraying his mother. The lie meant betraying himself. Finally, he exhaled. Yeah, that's right. Detective Harper wrote something down. Has this happened before? Another silence. I tilted my head slightly, daring him. Lie, Steve. Say it's the first time. Say it's just a mistake. Say you had no idea. His fingers twitched on the blanket. He knew I wouldn't let him get away with it. Not this time. His mother had gotten away with too much already. He ran a hand down his face. I don't know, he muttered. I mean, Olivia's been sick before, but I thought... I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. You thought what, Steve? I asked. That I was imagining it? That it was all in my head? His face darkened with shame. He knew. I knew he knew. Detective Harper's gaze sharpened. Mr. Bennett, your medical records show no pre-existing conditions that would explain your reaction. Your wife, however, has had multiple emergency room visits over the past few years with similar symptoms. Do you understand what I'm implying? Steve didn't respond. Because this was the moment. The moment where he had to decide who he was going to protect. Himself? Or the mother who had tried to poison me? The mother who had succeeded for years? I sat forward, my voice even. You knew something was wrong. You always knew. But you ignored it because it wasn't happening to you. Steve's breathing was shaky. I kept going. Every time I got sick, every time I sat in a hospital bed like you are now, you told me it was nothing. You laughed at me. You made me think I was crazy. I leaned closer, my voice like steel. But now? Now, you believe me. Steve closed his eyes. He had nothing to say. Because I was right. Detective Harper didn't let the moment linger. She snapped her notebook shut. We'll need to speak with your mother. Officers are already en route to her house. If she tries to leave, she'll be taken into custody. Margaret, the puppet master, the woman who had ruled my marriage, whispering poison into Steve's ear just as she had poisoned me. But now she was caught. Mr. Bennett, do you want to press charges? Steve hesitated, and for the first time in our marriage, he turned to me. Like I had the answer. Like I should be the one to decide. And maybe, once upon a time, I would have protected him, but I wasn't that woman anymore. I stood, smoothing down my jacket. That's not my call, Detective, I said. It's Steve's. He looked at me, pleading, regretful, weak. I gave him nothing. The detective nodded. We'll be back with more questions once we have her in custody. In the meantime, Mr. Bennett, I'd suggest you think very carefully about your next steps. She turned on her heel and walked out. I followed, not bothering to look back, not bothering to wait for Steve's excuses, his guilt, his empty apologies. Because the moment I walked out that door, I knew something with absolute certainty. I wasn't coming back. Margaret might have been the one putting something in my coffee. But Steve? Steve had been letting her do it. And that was unforgivable. As I stepped into the hallway, my phone buzzed. A text from my lawyer. I smiled. Because this wasn't just the end of a poisoning plot. This was the end of my marriage.